Now we complain that we need to protect ourselves from terrorists. Well, how many terrorist acts have happened in rural Georgia? I can't think of any. There's nothing that a terrorist can do to someone in rural Georgia because almost everybody is packing heat or is near somebody who does. And yet, we will deliberately manufacture in this country thousands of potential domestic terrorists who are ripe for the taking. Why? Because we want to be nice people. Every one of these things is because we're nice and we care and we want to reach out. We want to make sure that we're protected against those terrible bullies or protected against those terrible people who smoke pot or those terrible dads. We're nice. We're enforcing, in many cases, a code of morality that the government has nothing to do with. You know, even the sexual offender thing, there used to be a process for handling sexual offenders. It was called Daddy, Uncle, Brother, and baseball bats. These guys who are the most able to judge what's good for their daughter, sister, niece, whoever, would look at a kid and, let's say it's a 15, 16-year-old girl and there's some 25-year-old guy wanting to date her. Okay, that sounds a little weird to our modern ears, but 100 years ago that was perfectly normal. As part of the courtship process, the guy would show up and they'd hang out with the family and everybody would say, hey, is it any good? And if it wasn't good, they'd say, okay, hit the road, dude. And if you didn't hit the road, then out come the baseball bats or whatever the 100-year-old equivalent is. But we have abdicated that role to Big Daddy government because no one wants to apply the judgment that says, you know, I got to decide if this is actually a bad guy and get out my baseball bat if he is, or put the baseball bat away and let him go off and have, have kids and have family, have a great life. Nobody wants to use judgment because all the nice people want to abdicate that to the government because they don't have the guts to make those judgment calls for themselves. I want you to understand that this is not a civil rights era. We hear many times people think in terms of, I'm going to do civil disobedience, etc. I want to point out a little fact about the civil rights. I grew up in Mississippi, southern Mississippi. I grew up with the great-great-grandchildren of slaves, and I grew up with the great-great-grandchildren of people who were too poor to have owned slaves. Just because someone's from the South, for example, doesn't make them a bad guy. In the civil rights era, what was happening was that a few people in power were doing bad things to black people. But for the most part, everyone in the country was like, that's really not a good thing. We don't like the separate fountains. We don't like the back of the bus thing. And so, yeah, you guys had a demonstration and you raised awareness about what your plight is, and okay, cool, we can get along with that. Yeah, let's wipe out this whole racism by authority kind of thing. That's not the world we live in today. And we'll see in a minute the big distinction. But you can't make the mistake of thinking that we live in a civil rights environment. The battlefield has changed. And the people who enforce the respect of law and these other issues we talked about with creating second-class citizens, they have taken oaths to protect our liberties, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about the myth of oaths. The way good cop, bad cop works today, and you've all seen it on your videos, you've all experienced when you've been pulled over, when you've been arrested for speaking your mind, when you've been arrested for flipping someone off. The bad cop does his thing. Maybe he's standing with his back to the camera and poking the guy to make him react or whatever it is. But the 4 or 5 other cops, are they saying, hey buddy, stop that? No. They're like looking at their fingernails, I don't want to get in an argument with my buddy later, whatever. There's some guy that probably did something wrong anyway and deserved it. That's what happens with good cop, bad cop today. And we think that one day, some magical day in the future, somehow they're going to behave any differently. Well, the problem with that theory is tyranny is a continuum. Tyranny advances by small incremental steps. It is not a discrete event where you turn on the TV one day and say, United States is in tyranny. And then everybody knows to behave differently. So, in general, if you look at the data, in human behavior, the way the cops are going to behave tomorrow is exactly the way they behave today. It's just the issues will be different. The good guy will still be looking at his fingernails. He's not going to be jumping in with his cape flapping behind him, saying, "Hold on, buddy, you're doing the wrong thing." He's probably going to behave pretty much the same way tomorrow that he does today. So we have to think in terms of behavior today. Because if we can influence the behavior today, then behavior tomorrow will be taken care of, and that's some of what Catherine was talking about. Their excuse is always, "I'm just enforcing the law and taking orders," and that's important to understand. They are. Even when they're getting abusive, they're still taking orders, as we'll see in a little bit. Police also tend to have a demand of feudal "I am the law." Well, no, you're not. You're the guy we hire to arrest people when they break the law. You're not the law. If anything, we're the law, all of us in this country. You're just the guy we hire. But they have this demand of feudal fealty, and you'll hear Will Grigg talk about that later in the conference. And of course, we all believe here in this room that only local law enforcement is legitimate, and that is because local law enforcement is the only ones who are in direct day-to-day contact with the people they represent, or the people they're paid to protect, as opposed to someone who gets imported from who knows where. But the important thing to understand is reliance on their oaths can get you killed, as we'll see in a little bit. If things go very, very bad, your demand of civil rights will simply be seen as getting in the way. You cannot rely on an oath to protect you. You have to rely on what reality is and behave accordingly. This brings up the topic of liberty versus civility. Some of the things that trigger the fealty demand by law enforcement is, "I'm going to teach that guy a lesson." And they will often slap each other on the back later. "Hey, we taught that guy a lesson." Yes, you created a potential domestic terrorist, but yeah, you taught a lesson. Maybe not the lesson you wanted to teach. And we're taught that we should be civil to everyone. Liberty versus civility. One pundit even says it's the civilest of wars. Well, that's ridiculous. For a couple of reasons. One, is it a war? If it's a war, we're talking about an entirely separate set of circumstances and actions. But if we're not willing to talk about war, it's still silly to say we have to be more concerned about civility than liberty, because when it comes down to it, if you look at it from you on island with 20 people who want to take away your liberty, if they want to take away your liberty, they don't deserve your civility, they deserve your wrath. Your wrath. But there's just practical difficulties with that. Don't place civility ahead of liberty, because you won't get either one of them. This brings us into another topic, no cold dead hands. Everybody's heard the gun guy saying, "Hey, you take my gun when you take it out of my cold dead hands." I want to offer you an alternative here. All tyrannies seize weapons from people throughout history. It's always done. But weapon seizure, knife, spear, sword, machine gun, whatever it is, it's not about seizing the guns. It's for the social evolutionary purpose of killing gun owners. Because gun seizures start in a climate where everything seems to be fine, and it's reasonable to start chopping away at those gun liberties until finally they come to take them. It's an evolutionary process designed to get rid of the people who would use their weapons to defend their liberty, leaving only the mush remaining who are easy to control. It's for this reason you should not allow yourself to be duped into this cold dead hands approach. Because after all, the forces who might achieve one day tyranny in this country would have to face what I call the 100 million gun problem. There's hundreds of millions of guns in this country, and if they took 100 million away, where's the rest of them? Who knows? That's a big problem. So don't worry about that one. There's ways to get more, and should it come to it, outside the scope of this discussion, there are alternative acquisition strategies which can be used to obtain weapons if needed. So don't worry about that one. We're Americans. We can do things other people in the world can't even imagine, and we need each and every one of you who would fight the gun grabbers. We'll see in a minute what we need you for.